Okay, I'm going to speak about something I said a piece of in shul yesterday and another piece of yesterday afternoon about Parshat Chukat, which was yesterday, but really I want to speak about Friday, which was 2 days ago. I want to talk about the fact that Friday was a fast day that nobody knows about or observes, which is connected to the trial and the burning of the Talmud in Paris. How that connects to Parshat Chukat. I want to talk about the burning of the Rambam's books, and then Rabbi Eliezer. See if I can get all of that done in less than half an hour. So I'll start with Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham on Taf Kuf Pei in Orach Chaim is a list of fast days that nobody fasts on, that commemorate various tragic events in the Jewish calendar. Hillel once spoke about the 9th of Tevet that's listed there. There's many days. So the Magen Avraham adds another day, and he says, Katav Tanya, B'yom HaShishi Parshat Chukat, Nagu Yechidim Litanot. On the Friday before Parshat Chukat, some individuals, pious people, have a custom to fast. Shebato Hayom Nisrafu Esrim Kronot Meleim Sfarim B'Tzarfat, because on that day 20 wagon loads of manuscripts were burned. There were no books because this was before the printing press. Even though it calls the books, were burnt in France. Now, this fast is unique, I think, in that it doesn't have a specific date in the calendar, but it's always the Friday before Parshat Chukat. So why did they not give it a date? Because they had a vision in a dream, and they found out that it was the Parsha itself that caused this to happen. There was a connection between Parshat Chukat and the burning of all these, of the Talmud and all the other books. Zot Chukat Torah mitargamin and dar gezeret oraita. The Parsha, that verse 2 says, this is the law of the Torah, and it's translated by Onkelos as this is the decree of the Torah, meaning this is the punishment of the Torah. So he says that also Gam Bishnat Tavchet Nechavu Shnei Kehilot Gedolot B'oto Hayom. In the Chmelnitsky massacres of Tachmatat, also 2 communities were destroyed on that day, like the Shach says. But really what I want to focus on is what is the connection between Parshat Chukat and the burning of the Talmud in Paris. Now, I mean, the words Zot Chukat Torah, okay, but so what? I don't know why I doubled the slides. I can't move to the next slide. Haha. That is clever. So let me try and start again. If I want to present my entire screen and want to present this screen, maybe, and then I can maybe show that, no, that doesn't work. They just see a million of you. Let's not do that. I'll put this over there. Does that help? Okay. Now, if I change slides, yes. Okay, did that work? Just, you see a timeline now? Maybe? Yes? Good. So just a very quick timeline, because Torah really came quite late to France compared to it started in Israel, Bavel, the Gaonim. It moved to northern Africa, Morocco, and thereabouts, and Spain. But really, Talmud and commentaries on Talmud in France have only been there, or Northern Europe, have only been around for 150 years by the time the Talmud is burnt. Right? Let's say we start with Rashi, who dies in 1105. Now I want to include Rambam because of the Pulmus against Rambam, so Rambam is 100 years later. Maram of Rothenburg, one of the main teachers of Ashkenazi halacha, and his students became the pillars of Ashkenazi halacha, is at the same time as this burning of the Talmud. The French rabbis condemn Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim and Sefer Mada about 1235, and then a few years later we have the trial in Paris and the burning of the Talmud. So that's the picture I want to say. Magen Avraham lives in the 17th century. He's still talking about a fast day that happened 400 years earlier. Hillel once spoke about, should we have a fast El Slichot to commemorate the 7th of October? Here's an example where the Magen Avram is talking about a fast day to commemorate a tragedy that happened several hundred years earlier, which I thought was interesting. So some background to the trial of the Talmud. I've got to go over here to this. Talmud, Paris, is, I took the AI overview, which was cute. It is Nicholas Donin is a Jew who becomes a Christian and goes to Pope Gregory and says the Jews are saying heresy in their Talmud. Now, actually, the claim against the Talmud, the claim of heresy against the Talmud was started about 100 years earlier. The unique thing about Donin's claim is that he says the Talmud contains heresy against Jesus and Mary and the virgin birth. And that is the first time that the Talmud, there's always been anti-Semitism, there's always been Catholic anti-Semitism or Christian anti-Semitism, but this is the first time that the Talmud is put on trial for denying tenets of the Christian faith. So it's made up of, and so Gregory says, good luck, mate. Gregory is following after Innocent. He wants to show his power, wants to cement the power of the Pope across Europe. So he wants to show that power by telling Donin to go and speak to all the different kings across Europe and see if he can get any traction for this. All of them ignore him except for Louis IX, who is a very pious king. He's the only French king to be canonized, to become a saint. And he says, yes, let's have this trial. They bring in 3 or 4 of the Balei Tosfot against some of the Christian figures. The trial was rigged. The Jews weren't allowed to mention anything that would deny the divinity of Jesus or the virgin birth, and they had to somehow defend the Talmud against these accusations. Ultimately, we don't have direct first-hand records of this. The Jewish records were written at least 100 years later. There are some Christian records that were almost contemporary, but it seems that the outcome was clearly that the Talmud was heretical. I'm going to skip. I was going to talk about Donin. We know very little about him, actually. Pope Gregory, who called for a crusade, I think the second, but I may have lost count of crusades. He also made some papal rules against Jews more generally. He was really emulating his cousin Innocent III, who had been 2 popes before him, who convened the Fourth Lateran Council, which, amongst other things, said that Jews had to be distinguished from non-Jews by wearing special clothing. And so this was a time of consolidation of the power of the church and more generally anti-Jewish feeling. So the Talmud fits into that timeline and that sentiment of that time. Now, what's the connection to Parshat Chukat apart from those 3 words? I think there's a few obvious connections that we could just mention in passing, because I really want to get on to something else. So Rashi says, monin et Yisrael. This is the halacha that the non-Jews mock the Jews for. They say, why are you doing this? And therefore we say it's a chok, it's a statute. So in other words, already in Rashi, we're 100 and something years before the trial, we're alluding to Parshat Chukat puts the Jews on trial. And Rambam explains that further by saying that why is it specifically the red heifer? Because that is not done inside the temple. That is burnt on Har Zeitim, outside the temple. And therefore it looks like idolatry. It looks like we are offering sacrifices to the goats in the field, which is prohibited in Vayikra. And therefore, I would say that what the Jews do inside their temple, that's all okay. But when they start doing things that look like idolatry, that's when they get in trouble. And that's similar to the trial of the Talmud, where as long as people thought the Talmud was telling Jews how to live their lives, how to follow their rules. That was okay. But when they say the Talmud includes things making fun of other religions or mocking Christianity, that's when the Talmud gets put on trial. And he also says that the reason we have Tumah and Tahara, the reason there is impurity, is because of the Torah. Right? It was only when the Torah was given at Har Sinai that this concept of Tumah and Tahara began, and that separates us from the non-Jews. And he says it's Chukat Torah, that it specifically applies to the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral law, which again connects to the Talmud. And just to wrap this up with the Orach Chaim, who says, why is it Zot Chukata Torah? It should be Zot Chukata Tumah, Zot Chukata Hamet, like we have Zot Chukata Pesach, things like that. Why is it Zot Chukata Torah? He says because it is this law which separates us from non-Jews. I spelled corpse wrong. Whoops. Only Jews can become impure through contact with a corpse, and non-Jews don't. And it's this halacha which separates us from non-Jews. So again, that's why that's relevant. The burning of the Talmud, the trial of the Talmud is relevant, particularly for Parshat Chukat. Now, there were other rabbis who saw a different reason for the burning of the Talmud, not connected to the Parsha, particularly, famously, Rabbeinu Yonah. There is a unlikely to be true belief that Rabbeinu Yonah wrote Shari Tshuva when he realized that he'd been wrong in condemning the Rambam's books, and he wrote Shari Tshuva as atonement for that. That's unlikely to be true because Shari Tshuva was part of a much larger work. That's the only fragment we have left. There's no evidence that he wrote it specifically for that, but it is true that Rabbeinu Yonah realized he'd been his Rebbe, Avram Minahar, Avram Montpellier, and he had very strongly condemned Rambam for including philosophy, bringing philosophy into Judaism in the beginning of Sefer Amada and in Moreh Nevuchim. The French rabbis particularly took up this idea from the Spaniards, and they condemned Rambam, put him in cherem. This is 30 years after Rambam has died. And we have this letter from Hillel. There's a whole record of the arguments back and forth collected in a book called Igeret Kinaot. One of those letters is a letter of Hillel ben Shmuel Morona, in which he says, L'chein achai, al titmayim Hashem yitbarach oneshet Torah b'nei Tzarfat lichvod Rabbeinu Moshe. He's talking about the mistake they made in condemning and burning the Rambam's books, and he says, don't be surprised that the French, that God punished the French rabbis for the sake of the Rambam. Right? V'lo nasa panim l'sifrei Talmud shalehem. God didn't spare their Talmuds. V'eshkef aleim b'amud eish v'anan. He looked at them with a pillar of fire. Ad she'erish aleim kol ha'gelahot, until the church was against them. V'aznit chadshu gzerot gedolot. They made decrees. The church made decrees against the Jews of France. More than 3,000 Jews were killed as part of this. And all of their books were burned. Again, I say books. The printing press was not going to be invented for a couple hundred years. So these are all unique manuscripts. And even to this day, the French Jews are forbidden from learning Talmud, from learning Torah. And that's presumably why the Balei Tosfot had to spread out to so many other countries after this. If you ask, how do I know that this burning of the Talmud in Paris is connected to the burning of the Rambam's books? And I'll answer you, it's a clear sign, it was only 40 days from the time they burnt the books of the Rambam until they burnt the books of the Talmud. And they burnt it in exactly the same place. The Talmud was burnt in the same place as the Rambam. And the ashes of the Talmud was mixed with the ashes of the Rambam's books. The ash was still in the place. If I'm honest, I don't really believe this is literally true, but I definitely think this is how they understood the decree against the Jews of France, and several of the rabbis who had condemned Rambam regretted having done so and understood that this was being paid back for their condemning Rambam. But now I want to go to another person who was put in cherem, who was condemned by his contemporaries, who is very closely associated with Para Aduma. And that is Rabbi Eliezer. Now, Noach spoke about Rabbi Eliezer a couple of weeks ago in his Lunch and Learn, and I want to pick up and show a different facet of that story. There's a Psikta Rav Kahana on Parshat Para, one of the Midrashim, Rav Achim B'Shem Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says, B'shah shel Moshe l'shamayim, when Moshe went up to Har Sinai to get the Torah, Shama kolo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, she'yoshev v'asek b'Parshat Parah. Moshe hears that God is sitting and learning Parshat Parah. V'omer halacha b'Shem Omram. And God is saying the halacha of Parshat Parah in the name of the rabbi who's going to say it in the future. God says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Egla bat shnatah Parah bat shtayim. God says, Rabbi Eliezer says that a egel is 1 year old, a parah is 2 years old, 2 years old. And now Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to Har Sinai, after they leave Egypt. Rabbi Eliezer is he is one of the people who carries Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai out of Jerusalem when the temple is destroyed. So there is 1,500 years between these two events. But God is saying, in the future, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say this. Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Let's go, Amar Moshe lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribbon ha'olamim, ha'elyonim v'atachshrim b'shutcha." God, you're in charge of everything. V'ata yoshev omer halacha b'shmo shel basar v'dam. You're sitting and saying a halacha in the name of a human being. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God says, Moshe, tzaddik echad atid la'amod b'olami v'atid liftoach b'Parshat Parah tchila. In the future, there's going to be a tzaddik in my world, and he is going to open up Parshat Parah. Amar lefanav, so Moshe says, Ribbon ha'olamim, yiratzon shmilfanech shetzeh mechalatzai. Moshe says, in that case, I want him to be one of my descendants. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God says, chayecha, sure thing, shu mechalatzecha, v'shem ha'echad Eliezer. It says in the Torah, Moshe's son is called Eliezer. V'shem oto miuchad Eliezer. This rabbi in the future is also Eliezer. He's going to be one of your kids. So we have Parshat Parah. The rules of Parah are dictated by Rabbi Eliezer via God, which is a crazy scenario, but there's a very close connection then between Rabbi Eliezer and Parshat Parah. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, of course, one of the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we know, Chamishat min hayulo Yochanan ben Zakkai, ve'elihen, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hilkinas, he's the first one listed. And Huayam Moneh Shivchan, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said about Rabbi Eliezer ben Hilkinas, Bor sod she'eno ma'abed tipa. He is a plastered cistern who doesn't lose a drop. In other words, Rabbi Eliezer, not only does God agree with what he says, but he encapsulates what it is what the Torah is. He is the Talmud before there is the Talmud, right? He is the Word of God. Now, you know the story of Bava Metzia. Everyone knows the story of Bava Metzia. The Lo B'Shamayim Hi Machloket between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. When Rabbi Yeshua and the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Eliezer, and Rabbi Eliezer brings all the proofs in the world, and then ultimately he gets God to agree with him. A voice comes out of heaven and says, the halacha is always like Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Yeshua stands up and says, Lo b'shamayim hi. I don't care, God. Now it's 2 against everyone else. We're still the majority. The halacha is not like God or Rabbi Eliezer. And so everyone knows in Nitzchuni Banai, right, that Eliyahu Navi said that God said that my children defeated me. But what happens next in that story, which often is left out, is Amru Toyom Heviu Kol Torah Shetihir Rabbi Eliezer. They brought all of the things that Rabbi Eliezer had declared were pure, V'sarfum be'esh, and they burnt them. Just as they later, many 1,000 years later, they burned the Talmud. They burned all of Rabbi Eliezer's Piskei Halacha. All of the vessels he had said were pure. V'nimnu alav berachuhu, and they put him in the cherem, just like the French rabbis did to Rambam 1,000 years later. So Amru mi yelech v'yodio. Now he's in cherem. They said, who's going to tell Rabbi Eliezer that we've excommunicated him? Amar lehem Rabbi Akiva ani yelech. Rabbi Akiva says, Rabbi Akiva is presumably the oldest of Rabbi Eliezer's students, because Rabbi Eliezer, there's a lot of parallels between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva. They both started learning Torah at the age of 40, and they both knew nothing and learned everything. Okay. Rabbi Akiva says, I'll go and tell them. Ani yelech shema yelech adam she'ein hagun v'yodio v'nimsa machriv et kol ha'olam kolo. Because if the wrong person goes and tells him, they'll destroy the entire world. So Rabbi Akiva goes and he alludes that he's been put in the cherem, that he's been excommunicated, and Rabbi Eliezer understands and says, Zol goen ev dema'ot. Rabbi Eliezer starts crying. And when he cries, La ha'olam, the whole world is destroyed a little bit. Shlish b'zeitim, shlish b'chitim, shlish b'seorim. The crops are less, produce less crops, less grain than would normally have happened. Yeshomrim av batzek shbidei isha tafach. Others say even the dough that was being kneaded was impacted. Tana Af gadol hayabo toayom. This was there was great anger on this day. Shebechol makom shenatnu ba'einav Rabbi Eliezer nisraf. Anywhere that Rabbi Eliezer looked was burned up. So to me, again, this is the parallel of burning. Rabbi Eliezer, Torah, all these kinds of things, putting him in cherem destroys the world. And so now he's in cherem. Unclear exactly when this happened and how long he was in cherem for, because we know he did have yeshiva in Lod. But when he's in cherem, that means nobody's allowed to go and learn Torah from him. Nobody's allowed to count from him, you're not allowed to quote him, all these kinds of things. So at the end of his life, I was going to say Rabbi Eliezer gets sick, right? Skip the first line of the English. Kechal Rabbi Eliezer. He's sick, his students find out that he's about to die. So he's in cherem, but they're going to go and visit him one last time, he's about to die. He's sitting inside and lying in his bed, and they're sitting outside in the corridor, and then eventually they come inside, but they still remain 4 amot away from him because he's in cherem. Amr lehem. So he says to them, Lama batim, why did you come now? Amr lo lilmod Torah bana, we came to learn Torah. Amr lehem va'ad achshav lama lo batim, why didn't you come until now? I've been sitting here. Amr lo, so what they should have said was, we couldn't because you were in cherem, but they chickened out. They said, Lo hayah lanu panai, we were busy. We just didn't have time to come and learn Torah from you until now. Amr lehen, so he says back, he knows they're fibbing here. He says, Tamea ani im yamuta mitat atzman. I would be surprised if you die natural deaths, all of you. Rabbi Akiva says, but what about me? I'm the good guy in the story, right? Shali mahu, how am I going to die? Amallah, shelchak Hashem shalahen. Yours is going to be the worst death of all. Now, just parenthetically, we know the Gemara on Brachot, which talks about Rabbi Akiva's death. He's being tortured by the Romans, and it's time to say Shema, and he starts saying Shema, and the students say, how can you say Shema at a time like this? And Rabbi Akiva says to them, Amar lehem, kol yemei hayiti mitzta'el pasuk zeh b'chol nafshecha, afil notelet nishmatcha. My whole life I was concerned about this verse, that even if God takes your life, you have to sanctify his name. My whole life. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer warned him this was going to happen. He's had his whole life to prepare for this one moment of his tortured death at the hands of the Romans that was foretold. That's an aside. So go back to Rabbi Eliezer. Natal shtei zrotav ve'enichan al libo. Rabbi Eliezer takes his arms and puts them on his chest. He says, Oy lachem shtei zrotai, woe my 2 arms, shen kishtei sifrei Torah. Shigolan, they're like 2 sifrei Torah. Harbe Torah lamadati, varbe Torah limadati. I learnt a lot of Torah, and I taught a lot of Torah. Harbe Torah lamadati, lo chasati mirabatai afilu kekelev milakek min hayam. I learnt a lot of Torah. I licked up even like licking from a puddle, the words of the Torah. I got as much as I possibly could. Harbe Torah limadati, v'lo chisroni talmidai ele kemachol b'shvaferet. I taught a lot of Torah, and there's only, but there remains like a tiny little bit of lipstick or a tube of paint, whatever. V'lo od, meaning nobody came to learn the Torah from me. They only took a tiny little amount. I taught 300 halachot about a certain kind of tzarat. Nobody even asked me about these halachot. I taught or learned 300 halachot or 3,000 halachot about how to plant courgette, zucchini. Nobody ever asked me about that except for Rabbi Akiva. The number 3,000 here, the number 3,000 Jews killed in France. I don't know if it's a coincidence. Nobody's learning Torah from Rabbi Eliezer. He's about to die, and that's it. We're going to lose all of that Torah that is never going to be seen or found again. So his students quickly start asking him a whole bunch of questions, and he answers them very quickly. I just want to, before I get to that, talk about the Rabbi Eliezer sees that the world is going downhill rapidly. Rabbi Eliezer Gadol Meir Miyom Shecha Beit Hamikdash Sharu Chachamea Lemeavi Kesafraya, from the day the temple was destroyed. Again, he lived through the destruction of the temple, and he says that the Talmudei Chachamim are now just like the Sofrim. Safraya Kechazanaya, the Sofrim are now on the level of the Chazanim. Chazanim Ke'ama Da'ara, the Chazanim are on the level of the Amei Ha'aretz. V'Amei Da'ara Azla V'Dildila The Amaretz got even worse. No one's asking questions, no one's answering, no one's seeking Torah. Again, that was his experience. No one was asking in Torah. Who can we rely on? Only on God. And he always, that the Gemara testifies about him, Mitana Rabbanan, Mishemet Rabbi Eliezer, Nignaz Sefer Torah. When Rabbi Eliezer died, the Torah was buried with him. He was the Torah. He was the Torah Shabbal Peh. Now, if so, why did the rabbis put him in the cherem if he's the Torah Shabbal Peh? Because they were concerned he was going to be a Sadducee, start a new religion. He didn't believe in the Torah Shabbal Peh that Rabbi Yeshua was promoting, that the rabbis had the authority to enlarge and expand upon the rules. Rabbi Eliezer was a traditionalist, wanted to stick to the laws that God said, in the way that the Sadducees and the Karaites did. They put him in the cherem because of that. But the Gemara attests to the fact that he was the Torah scroll. His death was the end of all of that Torah, all of those thousands and thousands of halachot that we could have had. And so they ask him the final question, his students on his deathbed. They said, min al shal gabei ha'imum, if you have a shoe that's on the last, it's finished, but it's not yet taken off the last, can it become tameh or not? Only completed utensils can become tameh. This is finished but not finished. Amar lehen tahor. He said to them, it's pure. V'yatza nishmato b'tahara, and he died with the word tahor on his lips. Amar Rabbi Yeshua al raglav v'amar hotar haneder hotar neder. Rabbi Yeshua stands up and says, now the vow is removed. He's no longer in cherem. The purity of Rabbi Eliezer eventually comes to an end, even though the halacha is still not like Rabbi Eliezer. Almost ever, there's 4 cases, I think, when the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer. So I see parallels between Rabbi Eliezer, who's identified with the Para Adumah because God is teaching the Torah of the Para Adumah in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, and what happened to him, his cherem and his death and the loss of all of the Torah and the burning of all of the things he'd passed. And I see parallels with that, with the tragedy in Paris, with the condemnation of the Rambam and the burning of the books in Paris and the end of that era there. And that's it. Thank you very much.